The Lord begot me, the firstborn of his ways, the forerunner of his prodigies of long ago. From of old I was poured forth, at the first before the depth. When there were no depths I was brought forth, when there were no fountains or springs of water. Before the mountains were settled into place, before the hills I was brought forth. While as yet the earth and the fields were not made, nor the first clouds of the world. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he marked out the vault over the face of the deep. When he made firm the skies above. When he fixed fast the foundations of the earth. When he set for the sea its limit, so that the waters should not transgress his command. Then was I beside him as his craftsman, and I was his delight day by day, playing before him all the while, playing on the surface of his earth. And I found delight in the sons of men.
We are again. And today we're going to talk about Sophiology as it relates to the Old Testament. I wouldn't say the Hebrew Bible, but Old Testament is actually more accurate because the wisdom books written in Greek, Sirach, Wisdom, Tobit, do not appear in the Hebrew canon, so it's better to call it the Old Testament. Now, last time we talked about Margaret Barker's work. She's a Methodist theologian and Old Testament scholar, and how she has detected an exile of wisdom from Judaism after the reforms of King Josiah. And in redactions of the Old Testament, actually, after King Josiah, that kind of painted her out of the picture, where, according to Barker, she was a very important feature of Judaism prior to this. And I think you could also look at Christianity and Protestantism, for instance, that which downplays the Virgin Mary, and there's a kind of a need to fulfill the lacking feminine from a belief system, which you have in Catholicism and Orthodoxy. For other problems they might have, there's this real veneration of the Virgin Mary and presence in worship. So it's very interesting what Barker is proposing here, and I think she's got to be onto something, because it explains a lot of things about Western religion. One of the things, though, that's interesting about this is the wisdom books, which were written in Alexandria. There was a Jewish community in Alexandria at the time. Now, this is also what Barker proposes, and I tend to agree with this, that when the reform started by King Josiah, that there were those involved in temple worship who said, no, this is not for me, and they went into exile. I mean, they probably had to, and they ended up in North Africa, where these wisdom books were written. And there's a really strong presence of wisdom personified, or Lady Wisdom, in these books. She's an important presence. In fact, in the Book of Wisdom in particular, she's counted as God's presence through all of Hebrew history. And I'll read you some from chapter 10. So, for instance, this is just where it starts. She preserved the first formed father of the world, as meaning Adam, when he alone had been created. And she raised him up from his fall and gave him power to rule all things. Interesting that she's the one giving the power in these texts, But So I think, if we look at it in the first temple Judaism, there was acknowledgement of the feminine that encouraged her presence in worship. Now, there are echoes of this in Exodus, right, with the temple of fire and the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke that lead the tabernacle through the desert. Now, in the Kabbalah, for instance, that's called the Shekinah, the presence of the Lord, and the presence of the Lord is a feminine presence. So, but she goes before the Lord. There, she, just like in Proverbs that we heard earlier, that God created her from the beginning, right? But and he poured her out over all of his works, right? And the playfulness, where there's delight, she played before God, right? And she took delight in the sons of men. Now, also, so this is an important feature, and in fact, just to follow up on that, in the book of Sirach, chapter 24, when wisdom sings her praise, she says, "From the mouth of the Most High I came forth, and mist-like covered the earth. In the highest heavens did I dwell, my throne on a pillar of cloud," as I just told you, right? "The vault of heaven I compassed alone. Through the deep abyss I wandered. Over waves of the sea, over all the land, over every people and nation I held sway. Among all these I sought a resting place. In whose inheritance should I abide?" So there she is, going forth like a pillar of cloud. So this is important. Now, these works were preserved in North Africa, as I said. But another thing happened in North Africa and other places, Sinai Peninsula, it's all kind of on the way, this is the rise of Gnosticism around the same time. There was a Hebraic Gnosticism, and the Essenes were kind of Gnostic in a sense. But then in the first 1 or 2 centuries of the Christian era, there was a Christian Gnosticism that was very present there. Now, people tend to make too much of Gnosticism, act like it's the religion that we were supposed to have or something. It's crazy. No, the Gnosticism, the Gnostic texts, when I read them, they remind me of science fiction. I mean, there's truth in them, but they're not the truth. But what's interesting about them, as far as we're concerned, is there's a substantial presence of Sophia in the mythos of the Gnostics, but very different from Proverbs or the wisdom books. In the Gnostic mythos, Sophia is kind of a cosmic screw up who goes into hiding because she messed up. I'm almost kind of a super cosmic Eve, you know. So that's there. But it's interesting though that this arose around the same time as these Jewish communities in exile in Egypt were also kind of processing the same event, the same cosmic event as the exile of Sophia, because Sophia was definitely exiled from First Temple Judaism, and so the Gnostics, I don't know how they come up with their mythos, but it's very interesting. But unlike the Judeo-Christian opinion of things, the Gnostics held creation, the world as we live in it, to be a trap or an illusion, right? And that for some, even procreation was the worst thing you could do because it condemned people to sin. Because to live is to sometimes be involved with sin, so it must be evil, right? And this kind of Gnostic dualism that the spirit is good and physical is bad, but that's so foreign from the Judeo-Christian opinion of things. Now, if you want to look these up, probably the most accessible of the Gnostic texts that has this is the Apocryphon of John, sometimes called the Secret Book of John, which kind of lays this myth out in a very clear way. And also, it's one of the Gnostic texts that is more intact than some of the others. So it's very, so anyway, so it's very interesting the way this all developed. And as we said earlier, as I said in the first video, part of the way to think about this is when God says to in Genesis, "Let us make man in our image," that he is perhaps addressing Sophia, which really, if you think about it in those terms, that really puts a different spin on human creation and the creation of everything. It fulfills it in a sense, right? Because you're missing you otherwise be missing something, the feminine. Another place, though, to look for images of Sophia, and I'm not the first person who did this. It actually started with Vladimir Soloviev did this, I believe. Jane Led. If you look at Revelation 12, with the woman clothed with the sun, this is a very Sophianic image as well, and I'll read it so you can get what I'm talking about. Now, for a lot of Catholics and Orthodox, when they read these lines, they think of the Virgin Mary, and rightly so. But as we talked before, that for Burma and for others, that the Virgin Mary is the incarnate Sophia, or the created Sophia, you could also say, because she in a very real sense makes the supernatural, or God, visible, whereas Sophia in the creation, when we contemplate poetry or nature or something, and truth is disclosed to us. Similarly, Sophia makes that possible. We see God's glory through her. She's like the lens through which we see God's glory. And what's beautiful about this is, just like with the Virgin Mary in the New Testaments, there's this incredible humility, right? This not drawing attention to herself, but letting God shine through her. That's what Sophia is. But anyway, to go to chapter 12 of Revelation, here's what it says. A great sign appeared in the sky, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child and wailed aloud in pain as she labored to give birth. Then another sign appeared in the sky. It was a huge dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads were 7 diadems. Its tail swept away a third of the stars in the sky and hurled them down to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman about to give birth, to devour her child when she gave birth. She gave birth to a son, a male child, destined to rule all the nations with an iron rod. Her child was caught up to God and his throne. The woman herself fled into the desert, where she had a place prepared by God, that there she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. And immediately after this is the war in heaven with St. Michael and the angels against Satan and his angels. But notice with the woman here, and I remember I mentioned that in Gnosticism, Sophia is a kind of a cosmic screw-up who goes into hiding and needs to be redeemed. In a little footnote, an interesting place to look to see that same scenario played out is actually in William Blake's poem Jerusalem, which is pretty extraordinary as far as how did he intuit all these Gnostic paradigms, because there was nothing, not much available for him to read that would disclose that. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, so as in Gnosticism, Sophia is a screw up and goes into hiding because she screwed up. Here in Revelation, it's not that at all. The woman herself fled into the desert where she had a place prepared by God. She brought forth the miraculous child, and she goes into hiding by a place prepared for her by God. This is different. This is very different than we get in Gnosticism. So it's also, I mean, if someone could ever do this work, it'd be very interesting to see, and it would be almost impossible to really conclusively find out, as Barker has found out, but to really look at the relationship between the Alexandrian Jewish community, and later probably the Alexandrian Jewish Christian community, and the Gnostic community, because they're drawing on similar themes, but speaking different truths, and and uh, and you have to, you can give it to the Gnostics. I mean, there is one way to look at the world and think, well, it's evil, but there's another way to look at the world, and this is the Sophianic way, and see the good. Right? Isn't that what God says at the end of each day of creation in Genesis? And it was good. And God saw that it was good. And so, in a way, we could say that what we do in Sophiology is we try to either recapture the good, or another way to think about it is to anticipate the resurrection body. And here again, Virgin Mary is a great example of this in the Assumption of Mary. And the Assumption, right? She's glorified. She's glorified. She goes directly into the glorified body. And like Jesus in the garden after the resurrection, Mary Magdalene can't recognize him because he's been glorified. So Sophiology is in a way doing two things at once. It's trying to see the good in the creation, right? Is acknowledging and being present to the good in creation, but also anticipating the resurrection or the glorification of all things, right? And interesting, in theology, the word for the second coming is parousia, but it doesn't mean second coming. It means presence, right? It's always already happening. So, and Sophiology ties into this idea quite a bit. Another thing I'd like to point out, as far as the Old Testament goes, is in the Heavenly Country, I include some passages from the Song of Songs in the biblical Sophiology section, and the reason being is because there is an erotic element to the Sophianic. And by erotic, I don't mean pornographic or anything. I mean the eros that attracts us, because this goes back to Plato too, in the Symposium, where eros is the desire. A desire for what? It's a desire to be fulfilled. And so we love things, When we love things, it indicates a lack. So in the Song of Songs, the relationship between the bride and the bridegroom, when the bridegroom can't be found, the bride is beside herself, where she's running through the city looking for him, and that's us, right? And it ultimately, as Plato says too, this is a desire for God. But we can't just say it's only a desire for God, because it's a desire to be fulfilled as well. So in love, right? When people fall in love, they're trying to be fulfilled. Isn't it right? My father would always call my mom his better half, right? Which there's a lot of truth in that saying. So we're trying to be fulfilled, and And we see in Sophia in Proverbs. Not that she's trying to be fulfilled, but the fulfillment comes by her relationship to the Father, to God, right? And her relationship to the children of men. There's delight there. Why would you have delight? You can't have delight if you're already in a state of bliss. You find delight by having an other before you. Pleasure, right? You can't have you really can't have pleasure by yourself. It's not pleasure, right? You can't be fulfilled. There's a lack. It's an imaginal fulfillment. But with this erotic, and this is what we see when we see, you know, when we encounter beautiful art or things that move us, relationships. What's disclosed in that is the beauty inherent in the universe, and the Song of Songs attests to that. And I think it's it's pretty unfortunate that through church history, and this goes back to the Hebrew times, that the Song of Songs was interpreted exclusively as about the relationship between God and his people. Because it is about that. But it's also a marriage song, epithalamion, right? Celebrating the marriage, because that's a thing to celebrate. Because it recapitulates on a person-to-person scale what ultimately happens in a human and divine scale. And that's in a sense that's Sophiology, because it's not in Sophiology you don't have these hard and fast distinctions. You're in the metaxu, the middle place between them, where definitions dissolve. And that's important. And I guess to close, I would say Sophiology has a lot in common with Phenomenology, the philosophy known as Phenomenology. And in Phenomenology, there's this idea of the epoche, which means when you encounter a phenomenon, you try as much as possible to put your preconceptions about what it is to the side. You bracket those preconceptions or what you've heard about it. And even with this, you'd have to bracket what you think you know about Sophiology to experience the phenomenon as it is. And it takes a lot of practice to do this. It's so hard to bracket your assumptions, to keep your opinion out of it, right? Or to keep what you heard this is supposed to be about out of it. But once you do, you develop the habit of doing this, then that's where the disclosure arises from, that when you finally move everything out of the way and you can just be present to the phenomenon. And I think being present to the phenomenon of Scripture can also do this. I think this is what happened with, we'll talk about them later in this course, Vladimir Soloviev and even Jane Led, when they had these mystical encounters with the divine Sophia. I think it was really a product of their contemplative reading of Scripture, and presence. So anyway, I would encourage you to continue to do that as you proceed through this course, through life. Try to be present, and then we'll take it from next time. Thanks.